London in the late summer of 1666 stirred awake like a giant shaking off a long, uneasy sleep. The sound of wagon wheels clattering over cobblestones echoed in narrow lanes. Vendors raised their shutters, setting out baskets of bread, fish, and fruit, while the smell of coal smoke lingered in the air. The city had endured its darkest year only months before, when the Great Plague silenced entire neighborhoods, and doors bore red crosses as grim warnings. Now the silence had lifted, and the capital of England breathed again. Church bells rang out, not just to mark the hour, but as proof that life had returned. Streets that had been emptied by fear were once more crowded with apprentices rushing to their masters' shops, merchants shouting prices, and children darting between stalls. Yet beneath this lively rhythm there remained an unspoken tension, as though London knew it had escaped one calamity, only to stand on the edge of another. The River Thames was the lifeblood of the city, carrying ships from every corner of Europe. Tall masts bristled along the wharves where dock workers sweated to unload barrels of wine from France, timber from the Baltic, spices from the East, and wool from English pastures bound for distant markets. The shouts of sailors mixed with the cries of hawkers, and taverns near the water filled with the hum of foreign tongues. Prosperity was undeniable. Wealth flowed in, and with it, ambition. London was becoming a rival to Amsterdam as a hub of commerce, its merchants boasting of fortunes that could rival noble estates. But prosperity brought its own peril, for the city's rapid growth had been built without caution, and the very structures that housed its wealth were also its greatest weakness. The houses leaned toward one another across crooked streets, their upper stories jutting out so closely that neighbors could almost shake hands from opposite windows. Walls were fashioned from timber and plaster, while thatched roofs bristled above like dry tinder. Workshops and kitchens burned with open flames. Candles flickered in taverns late into the night, and hearths glowed in cramped rooms where families cooked and warmed themselves. Fire was everywhere, accepted as part of life, yet the means to fight it were crude. A few hand pumps, leather buckets, and long hooks to pull down burning walls were all that stood between order and catastrophe. No permanent fire brigade existed. The city was like a vast stack of kindling, waiting for the smallest spark to ignite it. Still, Londoners pressed on with their daily business, for the memory of plague had left them determined to embrace life where they could. Aristocrats rode through the streets in carriages, their horses scattering beggars who reached out with hollow eyes. Apprentices carried bundles of cloth or barrels of ale, hurrying through markets where exotic goods dazzled the senses. In wealthier districts, fine houses stood back from the street, while in poorer quarters, families crammed into wooden tenements, a single room sheltering half a dozen souls. Crowds spilled into alleys, and children's laughter rang out against the backdrop of smoke and grime. The city was overcrowded, but it pulsed with vitality, its people unwilling to dwell on the tragedies they had endured. Faith shaped the rhythm of life, yet it also deepened unease. Churches rose high above the rooftops, their bells calling the faithful to prayer, their sermons warning of divine judgment. Many believed the plague had been God's punishment for the sins of the nation, and preachers now cautioned that further trials might follow. Prophecies were whispered in taverns and printed in cheaply sold pamphlets, proclaiming that the year 1666 with its ominous number heralded the end of days. Some dismissed such fears as superstition, but for others the prophecies echoed too closely with recent suffering to be ignored. To live in London that year was to feel the weight of expectation, as though destiny itself pressed against the walls of the city. Politics added to the restlessness. The monarchy had only recently been restored after years of civil war and the execution of Charles I. His son, Charles II, sat on the throne, charming and energetic, but his reign was shadowed by mistrust. Parliament had not forgotten its power, and factions still argued over the balance between king and commons. Across taverns and coffeehouses, men debated the strength of England's navy, the ambitions of France, and the hostility of the Dutch. At a time when England was locked in maritime rivalry, Every foreign sailor who walked the streets seemed to attract suspicion. Old prejudices against Catholics, Frenchmen, and Dutch merchants flared easily, and the city simmered with resentment. Rumors spread faster than truth, and every misfortune seemed ready to be blamed on the outsider. The landmarks of London stood proudly above this uneasy world. St. Paul's Cathedral, ancient and immense, rose above the city, its Gothic towers casting long shadows over markets below. The Guildhall stood as a monument to civic pride, where merchants governed their affairs and defended their privileges. Along the river, the Tower of London loomed, part fortress and part prison, its walls a reminder of the monarchy's iron hand. These buildings seemed eternal, immovable against the passage of time, yet between them sprawled miles of cramped neighborhoods where narrow lanes twisted like a maze and wooden houses clung together in defiance of order. It was here, not in the great monuments, that the pulse of London truly beat, and where danger was greatest. That summer was cruelly hot. The rains had failed, and week after week the sun baked the city until the ground cracked and gardens withered. Wells ran low, and the air felt heavy with dust. Timber dried until it splintered at the lightest touch. Fires broke out often in homes and workshops, but neighbors usually rushed with buckets to beat down the flames. It was a routine so familiar that most gave it little thought. Officials warned of the danger, but vigilance waned with habit. The city had burned before, after all, and survived. Londoners believed it always would. Among them was Samuel Pepys, a naval administrator whose diary would later become a window into these times. He moved through the city with sharp eyes, noting both its pleasures and its fears. He wrote of nights at the theater, of laughter and song, of courtly entertainments at Whitehall. Yet in the same breath he recorded the anxieties of neighbors, the whispers of prophecy, the muttered suspicions of foreign plots. In Pepys's words, the contradictions of London came alive. Joy and dread, wealth and want, pride and insecurity. His London was a city eager to live, yet haunted by shadows it could not shake. The people of London were proud of their resilience. They had survived wars, the fall of kings, and the ravages of plague. To many, the bustling markets and crowded taverns were proof that nothing could destroy the spirit of their city. But resilience often blinds as much as it strengthens. The wooden houses pressed close together, the open flames in kitchens, the narrow lanes where wind could whip a spark into a storm. These were dangers everyone knew and yet chose to ignore. London had grown accustomed to walking on the edge of disaster, convinced it could never truly fall. And so the stage was set. A city crowded and dry, built of wood and thatch, burdened with fear and divided by suspicion, stood beneath a sky that seemed to hold its breath. The year 1666 carried with it both prophecy and peril. No foreign army, no plague, no king's decree would decide its fate. It would take only an accident, a moment's flame in the wrong place, to bring London face to face with a catastrophe beyond imagination. The spark had not yet been struck, but when it came, the city's long season of unease would burst into fire, and the world would remember what followed for centuries to come. And yet, the true measure of London in 1666 was not only in its streets or its monuments, but in the people who moved through them. The city's crowded lanes and timber houses told only half the story. The other half was written in the hands of vendors, craftsmen, nobles, and children who gave the metropolis its restless pulse. To understand the fate that awaited London, one must look closely at the lives they led, their struggles and ambitions, their hunger for renewal after plague, and the stark divide between wealth and poverty that shaped the city's every heartbeat. The streets of London were a theater of contrasts, each figure playing a role in the restless drama of the city. As dawn brightened the rooftops, market stalls filled with the calls of vendors. Women arranged baskets of apples and pears, their hands roughened by labor, but their voices carrying a determined rhythm. Fishmongers shouted prices over the din, displaying fresh catches, from the Thames and from coastal boats, while bakers emerged with warm loaves that sent their fragrance drifting down the lanes. The city's appetite had returned, and with it came a sense of stubborn resilience. These sellers had survived plague and hardship, and though their faces bore the lines of sorrow, their actions revealed an unyielding will to carry on. Craftsmen worked in their cramped shops, the tap of the hammer and the hiss of the forge adding to the chorus of daily life. Blacksmiths bent over glowing iron, shaping tools and hinges. Carpenters carved beams and panels. Tailors stitched with practiced speed in dimly lit rooms. Their skills were the backbone of the city, yet their earnings were modest, often swallowed by rent and the cost of food. Apprentices, some no more than boys, hurried to fetch supplies or sweep floors, their eyes wide with both weariness and hope. Each trade carried its traditions, handed down from master to apprentice, linking generations in the rhythm of craft and commerce. On the broader avenues, carriages rattled past, carrying gentlemen in velvet coats and ladies adorned in lace. Their presence was unmistakable, a living emblem of wealth and power. For the nobility and rising merchant elite, London was not a place of survival, but of display. They attended theaters where plays flourished again after years of Puritan suppression, and they dined in halls glittering with candlelight. At court, Charles II entertained with wit and pageantry, eager to restore the glamour of monarchy. These elites viewed the city as a stage for ambition, each encounter an opportunity to affirm status, secure alliances, or expand influence. Children were everywhere, their laughter and shouts echoing through the maze of streets. Some played simple games with sticks and stones, chasing one another past leaning houses. Others carried baskets for their families or begged at the edges of markets. Their innocence was striking against the backdrop of a city scarred by recent loss. Many had lost parents in the plague, yet they clung to the ordinary joys of play. For them, the city was both a playground and a teacher, its dangers and delights shaping them long before adulthood. In their voices, the resilience of London sounded most clearly, unbroken by memory of grief. Yet the city was divided, and its geography told the story. To the west, spacious streets and airy squares offered comfort to those who could afford it. Here, houses of brick and stone began to appear, sturdier and less crowded, symbols of security in a city otherwise fragile. Gardens enclosed by iron gates offered a semblance of peace, a refuge from the noise of the markets. This was the world of nobles, high officials, and wealthy merchants, where comfort insulated them from the harsher realities of the city. To walk these streets was to encounter powdered wigs, satin gowns, and the subtle scent of imported perfumes. Eastward, the picture changed. Narrow lanes twisted like a labyrinth, lined with wooden tenements pressed shoulder to shoulder, families packed into single rooms, sharing hearth and bed, their lives a daily negotiation with hunger and hardship. Here, the air was thick with smoke and refuse, and the stench of the river at low tide carried into homes. Laborers, dock workers, and servants formed the mass of the population, their toil invisible to those in finer districts. Poverty was not hidden. It clung to the very walls of the East. And yet, even here, life persisted. Taverns buzzed with laughter, ballads drifted into the night, and neighbors shared what little they had. In struggle, community endured. The yearning to rebuild after plague was not limited to stone and timber. It was a hunger within people themselves. Merchants sought to revive fortunes lost during the silent months when trade had faltered. Families dreamed of restoring stability, of celebrating weddings, christenings, and feasts once more. Theaters reopened, offering laughter and spectacle as a balm to memory. Londoners of all stations reached for signs of normal life, however fragile. Their efforts created an energy that coursed through the city, a restless determination that tomorrow must be brighter than yesterday. Still, the divides between classes were unmistakable. Wealth and privilege concentrated in the West allowed the rich to insulate themselves, while the East shouldered the risks of overcrowding, unsanitary streets, and constant exposure to fire and disease. The city council attempted regulation, but enforcement was weak. Tenants and landlords argued over rents, while the poor found themselves trapped in cycles of labor that left no room for escape. The contrast was so stark that London seemed like two cities sharing the same walls, one of elegance and ambition, the other of struggle and endurance. Religious life crossed these boundaries, drawing rich and poor alike into the same pews, though their prayers carried different weights. The wealthy sought blessings for continued prosperity, while the poor prayed for relief from hunger and rent. Yet the sense of divine providence was shared, binding the classes together in a fragile unity. Festivals, sermons, and public processions brought all ranks into common spaces where the city briefly felt whole. But once the rituals ended, the gulf reopened, and each returned to their divided lives. Among the people moved figures like Samuel Pepys, who observed all with equal attention. His notes captured the bustle of the market, the grandeur of the court, and the hardship of the alleys. To him, the city was a tapestry woven from every voice, every station. In his diary, a nobleman's laughter and a beggar's plea existed side by side, both part of the same living London. His words remind us that history is not only shaped by kings and parliaments, but also by those who sold apples at the market, hammered nails in a workshop, or guided a horse through a crowded street. The life of the city, in all its contradictions, was inseparable from its fate. The same energy that drove recovery after plague also fueled carelessness. Crowded streets that fostered community also magnified danger. Wealth that created comfort also bred division and suspicion. London in 1666 was not merely a collection of buildings. It was the convergence of its people's hopes, fears, and daily labors. They had endured the silence of pestilence and longed for renewal. They built, they traded, they prayed, they dreamed, and yet, in their midst, hidden among the timber walls and thatched roofs, lay the seeds of a disaster that would soon test every measure of their resilience. Yet beneath the rhythm of markets and the clash of classes, an unease lingered in the air. London was alive, but its life felt precarious, as if every laugh in a tavern or prayer in a church carried a shadow. The people rebuilt their routines after plague, but whispers of prophecy and the sight of timber houses pressed close together reminded them that safety was an illusion. It was in this fragile balance between resilience and risk that the summer of 1666 unfolded, a season when daily labor and festivity masked the quiet approach of something far more ominous. The summer of 1666 bore a strange and uneasy weight, as though the very air had conspired with fate. Week after week, the skies remained dry, the sun pressing hard upon the earth until the soil cracked and gardens withered. Wells that had once refreshed households sank lower, their water murky and scarce. Timber dried to the brittleness of straw, walls groaned in the heat, and the thatched roofs that crowned so many houses felt as though they could ignite from a single spark. The wind, when it came, carried dust rather than relief, swirling through the alleys and across the open markets. London was parched, not only in its fields and gardens, but in its very bones. The city lived in conditions that seemed to defy balance, where a breath of flame might transform an ordinary street into a storm of fire. In taverns and in churchyards, people spoke of omens. The year itself carried an aura of dread. 1666, a number heavy with biblical resonance, the so-called number of the beast. Preachers, eager to remind congregations of human frailty, declared that the hand of judgment might soon fall upon the nation. Pamphlets, cheaply printed and passed from hand to hand, warned of calamity to come. Some claimed to have seen visions of the heavens burning, of cities consumed, of divine wrath poured upon England for its sins. Others whispered of foreign plots, of Catholics and strangers moving silently through the city, ready to unleash chaos. For many Londoners, prophecy and rumor blurred until the line between superstition and expectation nearly vanished. These whispers carried power because they echoed the memory of plague that had so recently scarred the city for a people who had watched neighbors fall and whole families vanish within weeks. The thought of another catastrophe felt not only possible, but inevitable. Each hot day seemed a sign, each cloudless night another step toward the unknown. The bells of the churches, rather than offering comfort, seemed to toll with an undercurrent of warning. To the poor in the eastern quarters, whose houses stood stacked and fragile, the fear of fire was as constant as hunger. To the wealthy in the west, whose gardens had shriveled under the relentless sun, prophecy was less about physical ruin and more about divine punishment. Yet whether one prayed in a pew or gossiped in a tavern, the thought lingered. Something was coming. The officials of the city were not blind to the danger. Aldermen spoke in council of the risk posed by overcrowded wooden houses, of the need to keep watch for fires, of the wisdom of tearing down buildings to prevent the spread of flames. Royal decrees had long advised such measures, reminding Londoners that the city's safety rested upon vigilance. Yet talk rarely became action. To pull down a house meant legal disputes, compensation, anger from property owners unwilling to see their walls demolished. To enforce bans on thatched roofs or unsafe building materials meant facing resistance from those who built quickly and cheaply. The machinery of governance moved slowly, tangled by the weight of custom and the reluctance to confront wealthy landlords. And so the warnings were spoken, recorded, and then set aside, left to gather dust while the city's streets grew hotter and drier. The paradox of London was clear, a city aware of its peril, yet unwilling to alter its course. Each evening, as lamps were lit and hearths glowed, the danger multiplied, yet people treated flame as though it were harmless, a servant rather than a threat. Buckets stood in corners, but they were little more than tokens of reassurance. The notion of organizing permanent fire brigades was discussed by some but dismissed by others as unnecessary expense. After all, the city had survived countless smaller blazes, had it not? Why should this year be any different? Into this atmosphere of complacency slipped the darker murmur of prophecy. Clergymen thundered from pulpits that God had spared the city from plague, only to test it again with fire. Broadsheets illustrated monstrous visions, dragons, comets, and flames sweeping across crowded streets. Children repeated rhymes of doom, their words half play, half fear. Even those who scoffed at superstition found themselves looking uneasily at the skyline, where the sun set in red hues that seemed to stain the city with warning. Samuel Pepys, ever observant, noted in his diary the tension that thickened as the summer wore on. He described the dryness of the air, the heat pressing upon houses, the murmurs of prophecy that circulated in whispers. Though a man of practical affairs, he too recorded his unease, sensing that London stood upon a precipice. His words, written in the quiet of evening, revealed what many felt, that beneath the bustle of trade and the laughter in taverns, the city waited for a calamity it could neither name nor prevent. The contradiction sharpened with each passing week. Markets thrived, yet their goods lay beneath tinder-dry awnings. Theaters filled with laughter, though their timber stages could burn as quickly as paper. Carriages rolled through broad avenues lined with houses whose walls would crumble under flame. London celebrated its recovery from plague, yet every celebration carried the shadow of fragility. The joy of survival existed side by side with the certainty of risk, and so the city entered September with a heart divided. On the surface, life carried on. Ships unloaded goods, bells rang, sermons were preached, and families went about their routines. But beneath the surface, the ground was parched, the air was heavy, and the people whispered of omens. Officials spoke of danger, yet delayed action. Prophets declared judgment, yet offered no remedy. The city stood like a vast pyre waiting for the match. No one knew when it would come, or from whose hand. Yet in the silence between rumor and reality, London waited, its fate sealed not by prophecy, but by the ordinary spark of accident that would, in days, turn whispers into fire. And so London drifted into September, beneath a sky heavy with silence and rumor. The heat had dried its bones, the people whispered of omens, and the officials hesitated in the face of danger. All that was missing was the spark itself. When it finally came, it did not arrive as prophecy or judgment, but as something far more ordinary, an ember left smoldering in a baker's oven on a narrow street called Pudding Lane. The night of September 2nd began like countless others, with the city settling into uneasy rest beneath a dry and restless sky. The day's heat still clung to the walls, and the wooden houses creaked softly, as though sighing under the weight of summer. Along the crooked lanes, shutters were closed, candles extinguished, and families sought sleep in rooms that felt close and airless. London had endured long weeks of drought, and the silence of the night carried a brittle edge, as if the air itself awaited disturbance. In Pudding Lane, a narrow street not far from the river, the stillness broke in the most ordinary of places. Behind the shuttered windows of Thomas Farriner's bakery, embers smoldered in the ovens that had baked loaves for the city throughout the day. The Farriner family had finished their work and retreated upstairs, trusting that the warmth of the fire would fade by morning. Yet deep in the oven, a spark remained alive, hidden in the ashes. As the night pressed on, the ember found fuel, and flames stirred once more. At first, it was no more than a flicker, a tongue of orange that licked at the wooden walls of the bakery. But the building was dry, and the summer had stripped moisture from every beam. Within minutes, the flame caught, rising against the timbers, feeding on straw and pitch. The room filled with smoke, and the fire began to crawl outward, eager for air. Outside, the wind answered its call. A hot wind had been blowing steadily from the east, carrying dust through the city. Now it swept into the bakery's windows, fanning the flames into strength. Sparks leapt upward, scattering across the roof, and soon the blaze had found its path. It spilled from the bakery into the night, lighting the narrow lane with an unnatural glow. The darkness of Pudding Lane was replaced by the crackle of fire, a sound that grew louder with every breath of the wind. Neighbors stirred from their sleep, roused by the glow outside their shutters. They opened windows to find the street alive with fire, the bakery already consumed, and the flames climbing toward their own walls. Panic broke the silence of the hour. Families rushed into the street, some clutching bundles of clothes, others calling for water. But water was scarce, and buckets filled at wells seemed pitiful against the growing blaze. The fire had already leapt to the next house, its wooden walls offering no resistance. The street became a corridor of flame, and the wind turned it into a furnace. Sparks carried across the narrow lanes, landing on roofs that ignited as though awaiting the touch. The close-packed houses, leaning toward one another, gave the fire no space to breathe itself out. Instead, it raced from one to the next, each new building feeding its hunger. Within the hour, Pudding Lane was unrecognizable, transformed into a channel of burning light. The fire's progress was swift because the city had long neglected the simplest of precautions. The lanes were narrow, the houses tall, their upper stories jutting so close that fire seemed almost designed to leap between them. The summer's drought had made timber and thatch into kindling, and the wind, relentless in its strength, drove the flames forward with a fury no hand pump or bucket could master. Some residents tried to fight. They formed bucket lines, dousing walls with what water they could find. Others tore at their houses with hooks, desperate to create breaks that might halt the fire's path. But confusion reigned. Who had authority to order such measures? To pull down a house was to invite lawsuits, to anger landlords, to destroy property whose owners might not forgive the act. So hesitation ruled the night. The flames spread faster than decisions could be made. The Farriner family, whose bakery had given birth to the blaze, escaped with their lives, but their livelihood was lost within minutes. As they fled, the fire claimed everything behind them. For them, as for their neighbors, the night was no longer about possessions but survival. Families streamed into the open, clutching children, carrying bundles, their faces lit by the glow of burning rooftops. Horses neighed in terror, dogs barked wildly, and the cries of alarm rose into the smoky air. The fire's reach extended beyond the lane, creeping into adjoining streets. Roofs collapsed, sending showers of sparks high into the wind, where they drifted like fiery seeds toward new targets. The more the fire spread, the more it seemed to find strength, as though the city itself offered fuel willingly. By the time dawn approached, the fire had outgrown the efforts of neighbors, and the fate of London had begun to shift. In other quarters of the city, people woke to distant glow on the horizon, a strange brightness against the night sky. Some assumed it to be another of the small blazes that so often plagued the city, sure it would be contained by morning. Others whispered uneasily of prophecy, of the warnings that 1666 would bring divine judgment. To those who had not yet seen the fire with their own eyes, it remained rumor. But in Pudding Lane, it was no rumor. It was reality, and reality was spreading fast. As the sun rose over London, its light met another brightness, the flames of a city already changing. The wind continued from the east, pushing the blaze deeper into the heart of the city. Pudding Lane had become a memory, a street reduced to cinders. What had begun as a hidden ember in a baker's oven was now a force too great to restrain. London's long summer of whispers and omens had found its spark, and with it, the course of history bent toward fire. By the time dawn crept over the city, the fire was no longer a blaze confined to one narrow street. It was a force pressing outward, reaching for the heart of London. What had begun as a spark in a baker's oven now demanded a response from all who saw its glow. Neighbors, watchmen, and city officials would be tested not only by the flames themselves, but by the choices they dared or failed to make in the crucial first hours. The first cries of alarm echoed through the lanes, rising above the crackle of fire as neighbors stumbled into the streets. Doors burst open, families rushed out with bundles clutched to their chests, children half asleep carried in trembling arms. What began as confusion quickly turned to chaos, for the blaze moved faster than reason. The bakery was gone, the houses beside it already alight, and the fire pressed onward with the relentless east wind driving it deeper into the city. Some called for water, forming bucket lines from the nearest wells. The heavy wooden pails were passed hand to hand, but what was poured upon the flames vanished with a hiss, swallowed by heat that grew fiercer with every moment. Others shouted for hooks and axes, insisting that houses must be torn down to halt the fire's advance. Yet when the tools arrived, hesitation prevailed. To destroy one's own property was unthinkable. To destroy another's was even worse. Who would pay for the loss? Who bore the authority to give such an order? In the silence of indecision, the fire seized its advantage. The city's watchmen, called from their rounds, gathered in the glow of the flames. Their lanterns seemed pitiful against the wall of fire before them. They knew well the law. In times of great danger, buildings could be pulled down to create fire breaks. Yet they also knew the cost. Property was power in London, and to lay hands upon a man's house without clear permission invited endless quarrels in the courts. One alderman urged action, but another warned against rashness. The minutes passed, and with them the chance to contain the blaze. Meanwhile, the street filled with the voices of despair. Women wept as they watched their homes consumed. Men shouted conflicting orders, their voices lost in the roar of the wind-fed fire. Horses, maddened by heat and noise, reared against their tethers, and carts clogged the lanes as families tried to salvage possessions. The narrow passages that had once bustled with life now became channels of panic, where flame chased the desperate and smoke blinded the willing. The fire moved forward not only through wood and pitch, but through fear itself, each hesitation giving it room to grow. In the upper rooms of nearby houses, residents peered from windows, unable to decide whether to flee or fight. Some prayed aloud, voices rising above the din. Others cursed the watchmen for inaction, demanding they pull down buildings before the fire spread further. Yet the men of the watch stood uncertain, trapped between law and necessity. They could act and risk punishment, or they could wait and hope the blaze might falter on its own. Neither choice seemed safe, and so in the paralysis of that hour the flames crept onward. By the river, those who had escaped with carts and barrows made their way toward the Thames, hoping to carry goods onto boats. The docks became crowded with people jostling for space, while behind them the glow of the fire grew brighter. Merchants cursed their luck. Apprentices strained under loads too heavy for their backs, and children clung to parents as the crowd pressed forward. London had seen fires before, but few had ever spread with such hunger. The city, still half asleep in the early hours of Sunday morning, was waking into disaster. And yet, even as the fire devoured street after street, some believed it would still be brought under control. Londoners had lived with fire as long as they could remember. Small blazes had been fought and conquered many times. They told themselves this would be no different, that with enough water, with enough effort, the danger would pass. But the wind carried sparks across lanes faster than men could run. Each new house that caught turned hope into dread, until even the bravest began to wonder if the city itself was slipping beyond salvation. Samuel Pepys, awakened by the commotion, later recorded how neighbors spoke in hurried voices of the fire's advance, and how the watch debated without resolution. His words capture the mood of that night. Fear mingled with disbelief, as though people could not accept that such a familiar danger had already grown into something far larger. Pepys himself hurried to the river to see with his own eyes, and what he saw filled him with unease. A fire alive, restless, and utterly uncontained. What might have been stopped in its infancy was allowed to grow, for law and hesitation held men's hands. The choice not made became a choice in itself, one that would cost the city dearly. By the time the first light of dawn touched the rooftops, the fire had spread far beyond Pudding Lane, and those who had stood debating in the night now watched helplessly as flames surged into the heart of London. This moment, when panic overtook order and hesitation silenced action, marked the true beginning of the Great Fire. It was not only timber and wind that fueled the disaster, but also the frailty of human decision, the fear of responsibility, and the burden of law. A city that had long known the threat of fire had found itself paralyzed at the very hour when courage and clarity were most needed. And from that paralysis, a disaster was born that would shape memory for centuries. If you find yourself absorbed by this unfolding story of London's darkest days, you might pause and reflect that history is not only made by kings and armies, but also by the choices or the silences of ordinary people. Stay with this tale as it deepens, and you'll see how quickly fear, indecision, and a single spark can change the fate of a city forever. Thus, while the night had been marked by hesitation and futile attempts to resist, the dawn revealed a new reality. The fire was no longer a question of what might happen if it spread. It had already broken free of control. What indecision had allowed in the darkness, the wind now carried into daylight, and London awoke not to a danger contained, but to a storm unleashed. The fire rose with the dawn, no longer a cluster of houses ablaze, but a living force that seemed to stretch its arms across the city. The wind from the east drove it forward with relentless fury, carrying sparks like showers of stars through the air. The flames climbed higher than rooftops, painting the morning sky in shades of crimson and gold, as if the heavens themselves had been set aflame. Smoke rolled across the city, a dark canopy beneath which people fled in confusion, and the sound of crackling timbers joined with the wailing of voices to create a dreadful chorus. Ash rained down like snow upon the streets, coating clothes and hair, settling on carts and barrows piled high with hastily gathered possessions. Children coughed as their parents dragged them toward what they hoped was safety. Dogs barked frantically, horses neighed and pulled at their reins, and the shouts of men blended with the shrieks of women. The fire roared above all of it, a sound unlike any other, deep and consuming, as though the city itself groaned under its destruction. The churches tried to answer with their bells. From steeple to steeple the tolling began, a desperate signal to rouse the city and summon aid. Yet the bells themselves seemed drowned by the roar of the flames and the rushing of the wind. Their solemn peals, meant to call men to prayer or to arms, became instead a haunting counterpoint to the chaos below. Some took the sound as a final warning, others as a call to flight. Whole congregations poured into the streets, clutching prayer books, relics, and sacred vessels as they joined the throngs fleeing westward or pressing toward the river. The lanes leading to the Thames became rivers of people. Merchants drove carts heavy with goods, their wheels jolting over the cobblestones. Laborers carried bundles of tools and clothes on their backs. Mothers clutched infants close, pushing through the crush of bodies, their faces lit by the glow of the inferno behind them. The river offered the promise of escape, and boats quickly filled with passengers and cargo, rocking uneasily as more pressed forward. Some overloaded vessels tipped dangerously, while others shoved off hastily, oars dipping into water streaked with ash. The Thames itself seemed to carry the city's fear, bearing away people and goods alike in a frantic tide. Above all of this, the fire advanced with terrifying speed. It leapt from street to street, drawn onward by the gale. Whole rows of houses vanished in hours, their beams collapsing inward, their walls crumbling as sparks flew onward to new fuel. Taverns, warehouses, and shops were consumed in turn, their goods adding fuel to the flames. Barrels of pitch and oil exploded with bursts of light, sending new waves of fire into the air. The blaze no longer seemed like an accident confined to a single quarter. It had become a storm that no human hand could master. The sense of helplessness deepened as attempts to resist failed. Bucket lines dissolved in the press of the crowd, men dropping their tools to gather families or to salvage what they could carry. The watch, once hesitant, now stood bewildered, unable to impose order upon the torrent of panic. Even those willing to fight could find no place to stand, for the heat was unbearable, forcing them back from the front lines of the blaze. It seemed the city had yielded, not by choice, but by necessity, as if even the bravest efforts were swallowed before they began. Samuel Pepys, climbing to a high vantage point, described in his diary how he saw an infinite great fire spreading across the city, sparks carried into the distance, the sky itself glowing red. From his words, one feels the awe and terror of the moment, when the scope of the fire could no longer be denied. Pepys was not alone in his astonishment. Everywhere, eyes lifted to the sky saw the same dreadful vision, smoke blotting out the sun, flames surging like waves upon waves, and the city beneath shrinking before the onslaught. The fire had taken on a rhythm of its own. As the wind pressed harder, the flames surged westward. The poorer quarters nearest Pudding Lane had already been reduced to ruins, but now the fire began to move toward the markets, the warehouses filled with valuable goods, and the churches that dotted the skyline. Each time a steeple caught, the city groaned as though it had lost not just timber and stone, but memory itself. Bells rang until their ropes burned and their towers collapsed, their voices silenced in the roar of destruction. For those who fled, the feeling was not only of fear, but of disbelief. London had endured war and plague, yet never had it seemed so utterly powerless. People looked back at the walls of flame and asked themselves how such a thing could happen. Many whispered of prophecy, recalling the warnings of the year 1666. Some said the fire was the hand of God, punishing a sinful city. Others muttered of foreign plots, blaming strangers caught in the crowd. But whether by prophecy or accident, no explanation could give comfort. What mattered was that the fire was real and it was unstoppable. By mid-morning, the city was unrecognizable. The glow of the flames reached far into the sky, visible from miles away, and the smoke hung like a pall over the surrounding countryside. Farmers in nearby fields watched with dread, certain that London was being erased before their eyes. Within the walls of the city, despair deepened. Families who had once lived side by side now found themselves scattered, their homes vanished, their possessions lost. Some clutched keys to doors that no longer existed, holding on to symbols of a life already gone. At the river, the crowd grew thicker. Barges strained under the weight of furniture, barrels, and frightened passengers. Some people waded into the water, clinging to whatever floated, desperate to distance themselves from the heat. The Thames became both sanctuary and chaos, a place where safety was uncertain, but at least possible. Behind them, the fire advanced, the roar of collapsing buildings echoing across the water. The scale of the disaster was clear, even to those who had once dismissed it as a passing blaze. No watchman, no council, no brigade existed that could meet such a storm. The city's defenses, its buckets, hooks, and pumps, were relics of a smaller age, powerless before a fire that seemed almost elemental. The people could only run, carrying what they could and abandoning the rest, their voices mingling in a chorus of grief and disbelief. As the day wore on, the sense of helplessness hardened into certainty. London was no longer fighting a fire, it was enduring one. The city that had stood for centuries, that had survived kings and wars, was now at the mercy of wind and flame, and in the hearts of its people, hope shrank before the enormity of what they saw. The fire was no longer a threat to their street, their parish, or their trade. It was a threat to London itself, and there was nothing they could do but watch as their city burned. By the time the morning bells should have called the city to worship, London was already on its knees. What had begun as a blaze in the east now moved with frightening purpose toward the markets, the very core of its daily life. The fire was no longer a distant terror seen on the horizon, but a force pressing into the heart of commerce, where goods, fortunes, and livelihoods stood exposed to its hunger. Sunday dawned upon a city already transformed. The fire that had begun in Pudding Lane was no longer a local blaze. It had become a tide sweeping westward with the wind. By morning, it reached the markets, the heart of London's daily life, where stalls once crowded with goods now stood in peril of being consumed. What had been the bustle of trade only a day before became a scene of abandonment. Merchants who had risen early to save their stock now watched in despair as flames advanced on their stalls, leaping across awnings and devouring bales of cloth, barrels of oil, and crates of food. The scent of smoke mingled with that of spices and grain, filling the air with a pungent reminder of both loss and hunger. The city's defenders tried to meet the fire with the tools they had always known. Lines of men and women passed buckets of water from wells and pumps, splashing them against the walls of shops and taverns. The effort was noble, but hopeless. Each pail seemed to vanish in an instant, swallowed by flames that roared with a force no hand could master. Sparks fell upon the shoulders of those who fought, driving them back. The air itself seemed to resist their labor, for the wind caught every drop of water and cast it aside as though mocking their attempts. Hooks and axes were brought out, the traditional means of halting fire by pulling down houses to starve it of fuel. But here, in the midst of markets filled with goods and fortunes, the resistance of property owners was fierce. Merchants pleaded, threatened, and argued, unwilling to see their warehouses destroyed. Officials hesitated, unwilling to pit law against necessity. The result was paralysis once again, and while men argued, the flames decided the matter for them. Roofs caught, walls cracked, and goods worth fortunes vanished in smoke. The fire spread with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, as if guided by an unseen hand. It swept across Cheapside, London's busiest commercial street, where goldsmiths and drapers had plied their trade for centuries. Windows exploded from the heat, sending showers of glass into the lanes. Fine fabrics, silks, and woolen cloths flared in an instant, feeding the fire until it burned with the brightness of 100 torches. The very prosperity of London, its wealth in trade and goods, had become its own destruction. The people of the city fled before it, pressing westward or toward the river. Carts rattled over cobblestones laden with furniture, trunks, and hastily gathered possessions. Horses strained under the weight, urged forward by masters desperate to outrun the flames. The Thames became a highway of escape. Wealthier citizens hired barges and boats, loading them with their goods, their servants, and their families. Silverware, paintings, fine clothing, and treasured books were carried aboard, piled high in frantic haste. The river grew crowded with vessels of every size, each bearing the fear of its passengers away from the inferno behind them. For those without means, the sight was bitter. The poor carried what they could on their backs or in handcarts, their possessions little more than blankets, tools, or a few loaves of bread. They watched as barges filled with the treasures of the wealthy pushed into the river, while they remained pressed against its banks, searching for any vessel that would take them. Inequality that had always been part of London's life now became stark in the glow of fire. Some fled with their fortunes intact, others with only the clothes upon their backs. The firefighters' cries mingled with the shouts of the desperate crowd. The narrow lanes became bottlenecks clogged with carts, animals, and people as the flames drew nearer. Smoke filled the air, choking and blinding, making the very act of movement a torment. Yet still, the fire came on, relentless, carried by the wind that had shown no mercy since the first spark. The Sunday bells that once called people to worship now rang amid chaos, their sound lost in the tumult. Priests carried chalices and relics through the streets, parishioners clutching sacred objects as though they might shield them from loss. In many places, the fire found fuel that gave it new strength. Warehouses filled with timber, oil, or wine became instant furnaces, their contents exploding into flame. Barrels burst, sending burning liquid streaming down streets, igniting everything it touched. Markets that had once been the pride of the city became centers of destruction. Their goods turned from wealth into ruin. The fire grew not only in breadth, but in power, its heat so intense that men could not approach it, forcing them ever backward as it advanced. By midday, the scale of the disaster was undeniable. From the tower in the east to the rising ground of the west, the fire's glow could be seen, a line of destruction cutting through the heart of the city. Pepys, hurrying through the streets, recorded in his diary the despairing faces, the rivers of people carrying their lives in bundles, the sky blackened by smoke that turned day to night. He noted the hopeless efforts of those with buckets and hooks, men laboring until they collapsed, their work undone by the next gust of wind. His words captured what all of London felt. The city was no longer fighting fire, but fleeing it. For the common people, the sense of abandonment grew stronger. Where was the authority of king or council? Where was the command that might rally the city? Some looked for leadership among the watch or the aldermen, but found only hesitation. Others turned to prayer, kneeling in streets or fields, lifting their voices above the roar of flames. Families clung together as they hurried toward open spaces, St. Paul's and the fields beyond the walls becoming refuges for the displaced. Yet even there, safety was uncertain, for the fire advanced with a pace that mocked every attempt at refuge. As evening drew near, the first full day of the Great Fire revealed its power. Sunday, a day meant for rest and worship, had become a day of ruin. The markets lay in ashes, the wealth of centuries consumed in hours. The tools of tradition, the buckets, the hooks, the chains of men and women, had proven powerless. The fire had revealed the weakness of a city unprepared for calamity, and the people who had once trusted in their resilience now knew what helplessness truly meant. And all the while, the wind still blew, carrying the fire onward, deeper into the heart of London. The first day was ending, but the disaster had only begun. Monday, the 3rd of September, dawned over a city that scarcely resembled itself. The fire had not only consumed markets, but had pressed onward into the very core of London. By morning, the great commercial street of Cheapside, the pride of merchants and guilds, stood in peril. Once filled with the glitter of goldsmiths, the fine displays of drapers, and the bustle of apprentices running between stalls, it was now shrouded in smoke. Sparks fell like rain, and before the hour was gone, the flames swept into the heart of the district. Cheapside burned with a ferocity that shocked even those who had already seen streets fall to the fire. Warehouses filled with textiles fed the blaze like bellows. Silks and satins, brought at great expense from overseas, went up in sudden bursts of color, glowing for moments before collapsing into ash. Timber yards added their fuel, sending plumes of smoke that turned day into twilight. The wealth of centuries, crafted goods, rare fabrics, imported spices, disappeared within hours, leaving merchants staring helplessly as fortunes were erased in the glow of fire. But the destruction of property was not the only force unleashed that day. Among the crowds fleeing the advancing flames, whispers grew louder, swelling into accusation. Some cried that this could not be mere accident. The fire, they insisted, must be the work of spies and enemies. Fingers pointed at foreigners, Frenchmen, Dutch sailors, and anyone whose face or tongue marked them as other. Old suspicions, long simmering beneath the surface, ignited as quickly as the flames. Shouts filled the streets as rumors spread faster than fact. "They are burning the city," people cried, seizing strangers and demanding confessions. Some foreigners were dragged from their lodgings, forced to defend themselves against wild charges. The fear of fire fed into the fear of invasion, and in the confusion of smoke and flame, reason gave way to anger. London, overwhelmed by one disaster, now threatened to birth another within its streets. Violence among its own people. Authorities tried to calm the panic, urging citizens to restrain their fury, but their voices were drowned by the roar of the blaze and the desperation of the crowd. The king himself would later order proclamations against such rumors, but on that Monday morning, fear and suspicion had more power than royal command. The city was no longer only at war with fire, it was at war with itself. Amid this rising unrest, the fire pressed westward, its glow reflecting against the walls of one of the city's greatest monuments, St. Paul's Cathedral. For centuries, it had stood as a symbol of faith, its Gothic spires rising high above the city's rooftops, visible to all who approached by river or road. Now, as flames drew near, its stones seemed to darken under the pall of smoke. Clergy and parishioners hurried to remove sacred treasures, carrying books, chalices, and records to what they hoped were safer places. But the wind carried sparks into the very churchyard, and the vast timbers of surrounding houses threatened to ignite the cathedral itself. The thought that St. Paul's might fall was unthinkable to many Londoners. It was not merely a building, but the spiritual heart of the city, a place where kings had been mourned and where generations had prayed. To see it threatened was to feel that London itself was under judgment. Crowds gathered in the streets around it, staring with wide eyes at the encroaching flames, whispering prayers even as they fled. The bells, which had rung through the night, fell silent now, their towers shrouded in smoke. The city watch, joined by desperate citizens, tried again to form lines of resistance. Buckets of water were thrown upon nearby houses. Hooks were pulled against burning timbers, but the scale of the fire dwarfed their efforts. The wind whipped sparks across their heads, and roofs collapsed faster than men could move. Those who stood their ground too long were forced back by heat that seared the air itself. Again and again, Londoners attempted to make a stand, only to be driven back as the fire claimed more ground. Samuel Pepys, making his rounds across the river and through the streets, noted the despair and anger of the people. He saw merchants raging at their loss, foreigners harassed in the streets, and clergy hurrying with sacred books under their arms. In his diary, he would write of the fire's fury and of the rumors that plagued the city like a second disaster. His words preserve the mood of that Monday, a city undone not only by flame, but by fear. As the day wore on, the sense of inevitability deepened. Cheapside was gone, its treasures reduced to smoke. The rumor of foreign agents lingered, stoking division in the very hour unity was most needed. And St. Paul's loomed under threat, its massive stones still standing, but its fate uncertain as sparks rained down upon its roof. The city staggered beneath the weight of disaster, each hour bringing new ruin, each street echoing with both the roar of fire and the cries of its people. History often reminds us that in times of crisis, fear can be as dangerous as the calamity itself. On that Monday in 1666, London showed both truths at once, a city devoured by fire and a people consumed by suspicion. To understand how such moments shape us is to remember that the choices of ordinary men and women, whether to yield to panic or to stand together, can be as decisive as any battle or decree. Stay with this story, and you'll see how those choices would echo through the days to come as the fire pressed ever deeper into the city's heart. Tuesday, the 4th of September, dawned beneath a sky already clouded by smoke. The fire had raged through 2 days and 2 nights, and now it reached its dreadful peak. From the heart of the city, the flames pressed toward the one building that had seemed unassailable, St. Paul's Cathedral. Its great Gothic towers had stood for centuries, a monument to faith and a symbol of England itself. But as morning broke, the flames closed in, and the cathedral stood shrouded in smoke, its ancient stones glowing under the heat of the inferno. For hours, Londoners had clung to the belief that St. Paul's might endure. Its walls were thick, its foundations strong, and its stones thought to be proof against fire. Clergy and workmen had carried books and relics into its vaults, trusting the building to guard them. Even printers, desperate to save their stock, stored paper and volumes in its crypt, certain that no blaze could breach such mighty walls. Yet, as the flames gathered, the truth revealed itself with dreadful clarity. The cathedral was not immune. The houses that clustered tightly around its churchyard were the fire's first path. They burned quickly, their flames licking up the scaffolding that clung to St. Paul's as part of long repair work. The wooden beams caught like tinder, feeding the fire upward until it seized the roof itself. The great timbers groaned and cracked as sparks cascaded down, and soon the blaze found the lead covering that shielded the nave. Heat beyond measure melted it, and the metal flowed downward in gleaming rivulets, streaming from the roof like a river of silver. To those who watched, it was a vision both wondrous and terrible. The cathedral seemed to weep molten light as it burned. Within, the smoke thickened, curling around the vast columns and arches. Flames crept across the galleries, and the books stored in vaults burst into sudden fire, filling the air with ash and sparks. The roar of collapsing timber echoed through the nave, each crash reverberating like the toll of a great bell. For centuries, St. Paul's had been the heart of London's worship, a place of coronations and funerals, of sermons that bound the city together. Now it was a furnace, its glory undone in a single day. Crowds gathered at a distance, unable to turn away. Men and women wept openly, their faces lit by the glow of their cathedral's destruction. The fall of houses and markets had been tragedy, but this was something more. the loss of a symbol, a blow to the soul of the nation. Some knelt in prayer as the roof fell inward, sending showers of sparks into the sky. Others stood silent, struck dumb by the sight of towers that had once touched the heavens, now collapsing into ruin. The destruction of St. Paul's was not merely the ruin of stone and timber, it was the shattering of an identity, the unmaking of something that had seemed eternal. Amid this devastation, the king himself came forward. Charles II, leaving the safety of Whitehall, rode through the smoky streets with his brother James, Duke of York, at his side. The two princes of the realm confronted the fire not as distant rulers, but as leaders among their people. Their presence brought a measure of order to chaos. Charles urged the citizens not to yield to despair, commanding that fire breaks be made, that houses be pulled down to stop the advance. The Duke of York took direct charge of crews, leading men into the choking streets, shouting orders above the roar of flame. Where hesitation had once reigned, royal authority now pressed action forward. The sight of the king and his brother working among the people stirred courage in many. Men who had fled now returned to wield hooks and axes, tearing down buildings to create open ground. Lines of laborers and soldiers hauled buckets, dousing the edges of the fire in desperate effort. Though the blaze could not be quenched outright, its path might yet be checked. The presence of the monarchy reminded Londoners that their city was not abandoned, that even in its darkest hour, the crown stood with them. Still, the fire's power was immense. Whole streets vanished in the span of hours, roofs crashing, walls collapsing, the smoke blotting out the sun. The roar of destruction was constant, broken only by the cries of command and the shouts of the crowd. Yet amid the despair, there was now also determination. The city would not surrender wholly. Under the king's command, men began to fight, not only with fear, but with resolve, carving out lines of defense against the inferno. By evening, St. Paul's Cathedral lay in ruin. Its mighty stone stood blackened, its roof gone, its treasures lost to smoke and flame. The sight of its fall would haunt generations, a reminder of the fire's reach and the fragility of even the grandest works of man. Yet the day also brought a shift. For the first time since the blaze began, leadership had taken hold, and resistance grew more organized. London had lost its greatest church, but in its ashes, a spirit of endurance began to stir. That Tuesday, the fire reached its height, consuming not only buildings, but the very heart of London's spirit. And yet, even as the cathedral collapsed and the city reeled, its people found in the presence of their king and his brother a reason to stand. The flames raged on, but they no longer raged unchecked. The battle for London was not yet over. Wednesday, the 5th of September, arrived not with the terror of flames leaping higher, but with the slow, uncertain fading of the inferno. For 4 days and nights, the fire had ruled the city, advancing wherever the wind carried it, defying every effort to contain it. Now, at last, the wind shifted and weakened. The furious gusts from the east that had fanned sparks across rooftops fell quiet, and the flames, deprived of their breath, began to shrink. The roar that had filled London like the voice of some monstrous spirit softened into crackle and smoke. Where once fire had marched like an army, it now smoldered in scattered ruins, its strength spent at last. The relief was immediate but subdued, for the people of London had little left to celebrate. As the smoke cleared, the true scale of devastation emerged. The city was a wasteland of ash and shattered walls. Streets that had once been crowded with houses, shops, and churches now stretched as avenues of ruin, lined with blackened chimneys rising like gravestones from the earth. In every direction, the ground lay buried beneath embers, beams charred into skeletal shapes, and fragments of stone that marked where proud structures had once stood. It was said that more than 13,000 houses had been destroyed, their timbers consumed, and their stones cracked by heat. Nearly 90 churches lay in ruin, their steeples fallen, their bells silenced forever. The parish life that had bound neighborhoods together had vanished in a single sweep of fire, leaving communities adrift without their sacred centers. Among them was St. Paul's, whose smoking ruins dominated the skyline as a symbol of loss. Once the pride of London, it now stood broken, its collapse echoing in the hearts of all who looked upon it. The destruction reached further still. Great halls and guild houses, warehouses and markets, taverns and theaters, all had perished. The Royal Exchange, where merchants had gathered to weave the threads of commerce, lay in ashes. Hospitals that had served the poor and sick were reduced to rubble. Whole trades vanished overnight, their tools and stock devoured, their workshops erased. London, the beating heart of England's economy, had been hollowed in less than a week. The human cost was no less staggering. Between 70 and 80,000 souls were left without homes. Families who had lived for generations in the same lanes and alleys now wandered among the ruins, their possessions carried in bundles upon their backs or piled in carts beside them. Camps of the dispossessed appeared in the fields beyond the city walls, where people huddled beneath makeshift tents of cloth and timber, staring back at the smoking skyline that had once been their home. The cries of children mixed with the murmur of despair as thousands faced an uncertain future, their livelihoods gone with their dwellings. In the city itself, silence reigned where once there had been noise. No market stalls rang with the calls of vendors. No bells chimed the hours from parish towers. The constant hum of trade and labor was replaced by the eerie quiet of ruin. Here and there, survivors picked through the wreckage, searching for anything spared by flame. An iron pot, a chest half burnt, a key to a door that no longer existed. Others gathered to speak in hushed tones, recounting what they had lost, trying to measure grief in words that could not contain it. And yet, amid the ash, signs of endurance began to appear. Soldiers and laborers, under orders from the king and council, cleared smoldering debris to prevent new sparks from igniting. Bucket lines remained in place to douse lingering fires, while men with hooks pulled down unsafe walls that threatened to topple. Leadership, absent in the first days, now began to reassert itself. Charles II and his ministers moved through the city, issuing proclamations of relief, urging calm, and promising aid for rebuilding. The presence of the monarchy, so visible in the crisis, remained a source of fragile reassurance. The mood of the people, however, was not easily lifted. Anger and suspicion lingered alongside grief. Many still whispered that the fire had been no accident, that enemies had lit the flames in secret. Foreigners, especially French and Dutch, remained targets of suspicion, though the authorities tried to restrain violence and punish false accusations. The rumor of conspiracy had burned almost as hot as the fire itself, and now it smoldered in the minds of many, fueling distrust in a city already broken. The loss of churches was felt keenly, not only for their spiritual role, but for their place in memory and community. Parish records, registers of baptisms and marriages, deeds and wills, all had perished in the blaze. Whole lifetimes of history vanished in the smoke. For those who had looked to their parish as the anchor of identity, the destruction was personal as well as communal. To walk the streets now was to walk through absence, where familiar landmarks had been erased, as if they had never existed. The scale of ruin was such that travelers arriving from the countryside could scarcely believe their eyes. From miles away, the smoke could still be seen, rising like a cloud over the city. As they approached, the enormity of the devastation revealed itself, a scar that stretched across the heart of London. Foreign visitors who had once admired the wealth and vigor of England's capital now beheld it humbled, a city of ashes. Yet even in ruin, the resilience of the people began to stir. Families built makeshift shelters from salvaged timber, determined to endure the coming nights. Merchants, though ruined, spoke of restoring their trades. Clergy held prayers in the open air, gathering flocks in fields where churches had once stood. The fire had destroyed much, but it had not destroyed the will to survive. Londoners, scarred and weary, looked upon the ruins with sorrow, but also with a glimmer of resolve. The city had fallen, but it would not lie forever. As night fell on that Wednesday, the flames that had terrorized the city for 4 days finally lay subdued. Smoke still rose from the ruins, glowing faintly in the dark, but the raging inferno had passed. The wind had stilled, the fire had lost its strength, and the city breathed again. But the silence that followed was not peace. It was the silence of mourning, of reckoning, of a people standing at the edge of despair and peering into the long, uncertain work of rebuilding. In the days that followed the fading of the fire, London became a city of wanderers. The smoke had thinned, the last embers were being smothered by soldiers and laborers, yet the greater burden lay upon the tens of thousands who no longer had homes. From the fields beyond the city walls, makeshift encampments stretched into the distance, a patchwork of tents fashioned from cloth, timber, and canvas, snatched from the ruins. Families huddled together under these fragile shelters, their belongings piled around them in heaps too small to represent the lives they had once led. The air was filled not with the roar of flames, but with the murmurs of despair. Men sat silent, staring at the skyline, now jagged with blackened ruins. Women whispered to one another of neighbors lost, of shops gone, of futures uncertain. Children wandered barefoot through the camps, their faces smudged with ash, too young to understand why the city they had known had vanished in days. What had once been a metropolis of commerce and bustle now resembled a refugee camp, its people reduced to survival under open skies. Hunger soon made itself known. The markets had been destroyed, their stores of food consumed in fire or plundered in the chaos. Bread grew scarce, and prices soared beyond the reach of most. Lines formed wherever loaves were rumored to be found, and quarrels broke out among those desperate to feed their families. Water, too, was a challenge, for many wells had been fouled with ash and debris. The dispossessed gathered at pumps and along the riverbanks, filling buckets with whatever they could, the river's murky surface reflecting the despair of their faces. Where want is greatest, disorder often follows. In the shadow of ruin, looting spread. Some slipped back into the devastated streets, picking through the rubble not only for what might sustain them, but for treasures half buried in ash. Gold and silver melted by the flames still tempted those bold enough to search. Merchants complained of goods carried away under cover of night, while guards struggled to impose order. Bands of men armed with clubs or blades prowled the fringes of the camps, taking advantage of the weak. For a city stripped of walls and houses, law and order seemed as fragile as the tents that dotted the fields. Desperation reached even the proudest families. Gentlemen who had once dined in fine halls now stood among the poor, clutching trunks and satchels, reduced to the same state of exile. Servants, once bound to houses that no longer existed, scattered to fend for themselves. The distinctions of class blurred in the smoke of ruin. Wealth offered little comfort when estates had burned and treasures lay buried under stone. In the camps, a nobleman might sleep beside a laborer, each equally dispossessed, each equally uncertain of what tomorrow would bring. The mood of the city shifted between silence and grief, and sudden bursts of anger. Some railed at the heavens, declaring the fire a judgment upon sin. Others cursed the authorities for their slowness to act, remembering how hesitation had allowed the flames to spread unchecked. Still others clung to rumors of conspiracy, convinced that enemies had set the fire, that spies walked among them, even in the camps. Each new whisper stirred unrest, and the already frayed patience of the people threatened to unravel. Yet even in despair, London's spirit flickered faintly. Neighbors shared scraps of food, mothers comforted children with lullabies sung under canvas roofs, and priests led prayers in open fields. The people, though broken, sought ways to bind themselves together against hunger and fear. Still, the suffering was undeniable, and each nightfall brought with it the weight of exhaustion. Beneath the stars, thousands lay awake, wondering how long they must endure such exile, and whether the city would ever rise again from its ashes. The skyline offered little reassurance. Where once steeples and towers had marked the horizon, now only smoke-stained air and jagged walls remained. The ruins seemed endless, stretching from the tower in the east to the farthest parishes in the west. Each ruin told a story, of shops once lively, of homes once full, of churches once sacred, and each story had ended in the same silence, replaced by the low murmur of survivors searching for meaning amid loss. By midweek, estimates of destruction began to circulate. More than 70,000 people, perhaps 80,000, were said to be without homes. The number was so vast, it defied comprehension. To walk through the fields was to see humanity itself displaced, a sea of weary faces in search of shelter and hope. For many, the city no longer felt like a place of belonging, but like a graveyard of memory. London in September of 1666 was neither entirely destroyed nor entirely alive. It was a city in suspension, caught between fire and rebirth. The flames had gone, but their shadow lingered in hunger, in lawlessness, and in despair. What lay ahead was uncertain, but the people who wandered the fields and ruins knew one truth with painful clarity. Their city had been taken from them, and they stood at the edge of an unknown future, waiting for the first signs of recovery to pierce the heavy air of loss. In the aftermath of fire, when the last embers had cooled and the displaced crowded into fields and tents, the question that hovered above all others was one of blame. How had London, the greatest city of the realm, been so utterly consumed? Who or what had set the spark that turned timber and stone into ash? In a city staggering under loss, explanation became as urgent as food and shelter. People needed someone or something to hold responsible for the devastation. The first and most obvious target was Thomas Farriner, the baker of Pudding Lane. His oven had been the cradle of the flame, his bakery the place where the first sparks had sprung into life. For many, the story ended there. A careless ember, a neglected fire, a man whose trade in bread had by chance or folly destroyed a metropolis. Farriner himself insisted that his ovens had been properly doused, and that the fire must have been set deliberately. His family swore they had done nothing unusual that night, and that no negligence had occurred. But in the fury of the people, denials carried little weight. For a time, Farriner lived under suspicion, his name tied forever to the catastrophe that began in his shop. Yet suspicion rarely stops with one man. In the chaos of rumor and fear, blame leapt across borders. Londoners, already restless after years of war with the Dutch and uneasy relations with the French, began to cast their eyes upon strangers in their midst. Foreigners, they said, must have set the blaze. Spies sent to weaken England. Saboteurs acting under secret orders. In taverns and marketplaces, whispers of conspiracy grew loud. Frenchmen were seized in the streets, Dutchmen accused, Italians and Spaniards eyed with hostility. One unfortunate Frenchman, unable to speak English and carrying a ball of clay for his trade, was beaten by a mob who declared the lump to be a fireball meant to ignite the city. These suspicions were fed not only by fear, but by old prejudices. The Great Plague of the previous year had already convinced many that divine anger hung over the city. Now, with London in ashes, some saw in the fire the hand of God himself. Sermons thundered that the disaster was judgment upon a sinful capital, punishment for vice, luxury, and irreligion. For the devout, the fire was not the work of man at all, but of heaven. In the flames they read a moral lesson, and in the ruins a warning that the city must repent or face further wrath. Thus London, in its grief, became a city of explanations, each shaped by fear, suspicion, or faith. Some said Farriner was guilty, others the foreigners, others still the Almighty. Yet beyond accusation, a quieter truth began to emerge, spoken not in the cries of the mob, but in the deliberations of men who studied the ruins with more sober eyes. The fire had been no simple accident, nor wholly the work of malice, divine or human. It had been the inevitable consequence of the city itself. London in 1666 was a city built to burn. Its houses were of timber and thatch, leaning close across narrow lanes where a man might shake hands from one window to another. Its streets twisted and cramped, offering no space to halt a blaze once begun. Warehouses filled with tar, pitch, wine, and oil were scattered among homes and shops. The summer had been dry, the winds fierce, and the city possessed no organized means to resist fire. Buckets and hooks, pumps and axes, these were the tools of centuries past, wielded by neighbors rather than by trained brigades. Against a spark, they were enough. Against a storm of flame, they were nothing. The fire was not the crime of a single man, but the verdict of a city unprepared. The government recognized that the truth must be sought. Parliament, convening in the weeks after the fire, established a commission of inquiry. Lords and commoners alike demanded to know what had happened and whether negligence or treachery lay at its root. Witnesses were called, testimony gathered, records examined. The story of Pudding Lane was told again and again, each retelling, adding detail or contradiction. Neighbors spoke of the first hours, of the wind and the flames, of the watch's hesitation. Foreigners testified to their innocence, clergy to divine judgment, merchants to the ruin of their goods. From these hearings emerged a remarkable record, the official journal of the fire's progress, a document that traced in sober language the spread of destruction and the failures that had allowed it. It did not name spies or invoke the wrath of heaven. Instead, it spoke of timber and wind, of narrow lanes and indecision. It placed responsibility not upon a single baker, nor upon the strangers in London's streets, but upon the city itself, its ancient fabric, and its neglect of preparation. Still, this truth was hard for many to accept. Blame is easier when it rests upon a face, a name, an enemy. To accuse the city was to accuse everyone and no one, to admit that London's greatness had concealed fatal weakness. And so, the myths of the fire endured. Farriner's name remained forever tied to the spark. Foreigners continued to live under suspicion. Preachers thundered of divine wrath for years afterward. Yet beneath these tales lay the careful record of Parliament, which showed, with the coolness of ink on parchment, that the fire had been less a plot than a consequence. The Commission's findings were a turning point, for they pointed the way to what must come next. If the fire was born of timber, lanes, and neglect, then only by rebuilding differently could the city hope to rise secure. The record of the blaze became more than a history of loss. It was a blueprint for renewal, the first draft of a new London to be built upon the ashes of the old. Thus, in the smoke of accusation and the silence of ruins, London began the work of understanding its calamity. The search for blame gave way, slowly, to the search for cause, and from cause to remedy. In that shift lay the first faint light of recovery, the recognition that though the fire had destroyed, it had also revealed. It had stripped away the pretenses of strength and laid bare the truth of vulnerability. And in that truth was the possibility of something greater, a city not only reborn but remade. The great fire of London did not end when its flames went out. Long after the embers cooled and the ruins stood silent, the disaster lived on in memory. It became not only a matter of loss and rebuilding, but a story carried forward in words, images, and imagination. To the survivors, the fire was an event never to be forgotten. To later generations, it became a symbol of both destruction and renewal, recorded in ink and paint, retold in sermons, songs, and tales whispered by firelight. Samuel Pepys, whose diary had already chronicled the plague of the previous year, gave perhaps the most vivid record of the fire. Each day he observed, reflected, and wrote with the eye of a man both horrified and fascinated by what he saw. He described running to the river at dawn to watch the blaze consume whole streets, of carrying away valuables by boat, of the terror of the crowds pressing westward with all they could carry. His words captured not only the spectacle but the emotion, the despair, the fear, the sense of helplessness. In Pepys's pages, one can still hear the roar of the flames and the cries of the dispossessed, preserved as if time itself had written them down. John Evelyn, too, left a diary that stands as a counterpart to Pepys's. Where Pepys gave immediacy, Evelyn offered reflection. He described the fire as a calamity ordained by Providence, a judgment upon the city, yet also a chance for renewal. He noted the breadth of the destruction with precision. Miles of houses, churches, and halls vanished, tens of thousands left wandering. His entries were tinged with sorrow, but also with an eye toward what might be learned. To Evelyn, the fire was not only catastrophe, but also revelation, a reminder that human grandeur must always reckon with divine will and natural force. Together, these diaries form the heartbeat of our understanding. They are not official proclamations or distant histories, but the voices of men who stood among the ashes and tried to give sense to what they witnessed. Centuries later, their words still carry the immediacy of that September, a window into the soul of a city undone yet unbowed. But memory did not remain confined to the written word. Artists soon sought to capture what prose could not. Painters turned their eyes to the sky over London, depicting the red glow that was said to be visible for miles around. In their canvases, the city appears silhouetted against sheets of flame, the river crowded with boats heavy with refugees. These images, dramatic and haunting, carried the fire into the imagination of those who had not seen it. Engravings circulated across Europe, spreading the vision of London's calamity to those far beyond its borders. Poets, too, found in the fire a theme of awe and terror. Some cast it as divine judgment, echoing the sermons that thundered from pulpits in the months that followed. Others sought more human lessons, warning of negligence, greed, or the folly of pride. Verses spoke of towers collapsing, of families fleeing, of the strange beauty of fire as it devoured the works of centuries. In rhyme and rhythm, the city's suffering was transformed into something that could be carried in memory, a lesson woven into language. Even among the common people, memory took shape in story. Folktales sprang up about omens seen before the fire, of strange lights in the sky, of foreigners glimpsed slipping through alleys with lanterns in hand. Children grew up hearing tales of how London burned, told by parents and grandparents who had walked among the ruins. Over time, the Great Fire became less a single event and more a chapter in the city's folklore, a story retold to explain the cracks in the old walls or the emptiness of once crowded parishes. This layering of memory, diary, painting, poem, tale, ensured that the fire would never fade into mere numbers. 13,000 houses, 87 churches, tens of thousands homeless. These statistics alone could not convey the truth. But in Pepys's frantic entries, in Evelyn's solemn reflections, in the painter's fiery skies, and the poet's somber lines, the experience lives again. Through them, we see not only what was lost, but what endured, the determination to remember, to learn, to rebuild. Memory also gave the fire a dual nature in the collective mind. It was both terror and opportunity, destruction and rebirth. Artists who painted the ruins often placed in their works a hint of the new city rising from the ashes. Poets who mourned the loss of St. Paul's also spoke of the glory of the new cathedral that would one day rise. In this way, remembrance was not only lament, but also hope. The fire became part of London's identity, a scar, but also a foundation. History is often remembered not only through its facts, but through the stories that shape them. The Great Fire of London is remembered because men wrote, painted, and spoke it into permanence. And as we listen to their words and imagine their visions, we find ourselves drawn into the story as well. To remember the fire is to walk again through its ruins, to see the silver streams of molten lead upon St. Paul's, to feel the press of the crowds at the river, to hear the silence after the flames were gone. It is in these memories, carried across centuries, that the Great Fire remains alive. And as you continue with this story, you too become part of that long chain of remembrance. Another witness, centuries later, keeping alive the image of a city that burned and endured. When the smoke had cleared and the ruins cooled, the greatest question that remained was not who had caused the fire, but how London could rise again. For all the grief and loss, there remained a determination that the city would not be left a wasteland. It was a conviction felt in the streets and declared at the highest levels of power. Charles II, who had stood among the flames during the fire itself, now stepped forward as the figure who would guide the city's rebirth. The king made clear that rebuilding would not simply restore what had been lost, but would seize the chance to make something new. He called for order amid the chaos of ruin, urging that no hasty rebuilding be done without plan or design. Royal proclamations were issued to halt the patchwork of makeshift repairs, to prevent the city from springing up again in the same tangled form that had allowed the fire to thrive. It was a vision of renewal, a London that would be grander, stronger, and more orderly than before. In this moment, the figure of Sir Christopher Wren emerged. Already known for his brilliance in mathematics, astronomy, and design, Wren was now entrusted with the task of reimagining a city from its ashes. He walked the ruined streets, measuring, sketching, and envisioning a London worthy of its place as the heart of a growing empire. What he proposed was not merely a reconstruction, but a transformation. Wren's plan was bold, sweeping aside the crooked medieval lanes in favor of broad boulevards and open squares. He envisioned avenues that radiated outward like the spokes of a wheel, anchored by great piazzas and framed by uniform rows of elegant buildings. It was a vision inspired by the cities of the continent, Paris and Rome, but adapted to the character of London. At the center of this new city would rise a new St. Paul's Cathedral, not the Gothic spire that had fallen, but a dome of such scale and majesty that it would proclaim England's faith and power to the world. This vision was met with admiration, but also with the hard realities of property and cost. London was not an empty canvas, but a place of countless owners, each eager to reclaim land and rebuild quickly. To impose sweeping boulevards required sweeping away property lines, compensations, and disputes that would take years to settle. Parliament, though impressed by Wren's imagination, knew that time and money were short. The city needed homes and shops immediately. As a result, the grandest parts of Wren's design remained on paper, a dream of what might have been. Yet even if the plan as a whole was not realized, its spirit endured. Regulations were enacted to ensure that houses be rebuilt in brick and stone, not timber, to reduce the risk of future flames. Streets were widened, alleys straightened, and space made for the movement of carts and people. Above all, Wren was entrusted with the rebuilding of St. Paul's itself, the centerpiece of his vision and the crown of the new London. For the people of the city, the act of rebuilding was more than practical. It was symbolic. Each brick laid, each wall raised was a declaration that London had not been conquered. Out of ashes, a stronger city would rise. The trauma of the fire would not be forgotten, but it would be overcome. In the determination of king, council, and citizen alike, the outlines of a new city began to take shape. In these first steps of reconstruction, one sees the enduring lesson of disaster, that even in the darkest ruin, the will to rebuild can turn ashes into foundation. The Great Fire had shown London its weakness, but it had also opened the path to renewal. And as you listen to this story, you too walk those streets of memory, where destruction gave way to vision, and vision gave birth to hope. From the ashes of the old city, a new London slowly began to rise. It was not a swift transformation, nor one free of conflict, but over the years that followed the Great Fire, the outlines of a modern capital took form. The rebuilding was shaped by law, necessity, and vision, by the resolve to ensure that such a calamity would never again consume the city in the same way. The most visible change lay in the materials of construction. Timber, once the common frame of London's houses, gave way to brick and stone. Parliament decreed that no building should henceforth be raised in the flammable manner of the past. The decision was practical, born of fear as much as foresight. Brick did not burn as timber did, and stone stood firm where wood collapsed. Though more costly and slower to build, these materials promised a city less vulnerable to sparks and wind. Thus, street by street, house by house, London exchanged the fragile for the enduring. The character of its neighborhoods altered. No longer the jumble of leaning timber dwellings, but steadier rows of brick facades, each wall a reminder of lessons painfully learned. The streets themselves were altered too. The cramped alleys that had carried the fire so swiftly were widened, their courses straightened where possible. Space was left between buildings where once every inch had been claimed. Marketplaces were opened more broadly, thoroughfares cut to allow carts and carriages to pass with ease. These changes were not as grand as Wren's vision of sweeping boulevards, but they marked a decisive shift. London would not again be the labyrinth of medieval lanes that had perished in flame. It would instead be a city of greater clarity, a place where air and space lent both beauty and safety. At the heart of this rebuilding stood the greatest project of all, the new St. Paul's Cathedral. The ruins of the old Gothic church had been mourned as a national tragedy, its fall a symbol of the city's humiliation. To rebuild it was more than an architectural necessity. It was an act of healing, of defiance, of hope. And in the person of Sir Christopher Wren, England found the man who would give form to that hope. Wren's design for St. Paul's was unlike anything London had seen before. Where the old cathedral had risen in spires and pointed arches, the new would rise in a dome of monumental scale. Inspired by the grandeur of Rome, yet marked with the character of England, the dome soared above the city, a vision of unity and faith that could be seen from miles away. Its lines were balanced, its spaces harmonious, its symbolism unmistakable. Here was London reborn. The construction of the cathedral was a labor of decades. Generations watched as its walls climbed skyward, as scaffolds wrapped its rising dome, as masons carved and set stone upon stone. Each phase marked the persistence of a people determined to see their city restored in glory. And when at last the dome was complete, St. Paul's stood not only as a church, but as the crown of the new London, a monument to endurance. It became the place where victories were celebrated, where heroes were remembered, where the nation gathered in thanksgiving. In its vast dome, England found a symbol not of fire and ruin, but of renewal and strength. This transformation of materials, streets, and monuments changed more than the city's appearance. It reshaped its identity. London became known not as the city that burned, but as the city that rose again. The fire was remembered, but it was no longer the final word. Instead, the memory of flames was bound together with the vision of resilience, a reminder that catastrophe had been met with resolve. The modern London that emerged bore the marks of compromise and of vision combined. Wren's sweeping boulevards were never built, yet his principles guided the reconstruction. Order replaced chaos, permanence replaced fragility. The brick houses that line the widened streets spoke of security. The dome of St. Paul's spoke of spirit. Together, they declared that London was no longer a medieval relic, but a capital worthy of a new age. To those who had survived the fire, the new city was a daily reassurance that their suffering had not been in vain. To their descendants, it became the stage upon which new chapters of history would unfold. From the ashes of 1666 had come a London ready to face the centuries ahead, a London of merchants and monarchs, of poets and preachers, of citizens who lived not only in memory of the fire, but in the strength of what had risen from it. So it was that out of destruction, a modern city was born. Its streets bore scars, its people remembered loss, but its skyline proclaimed endurance. The Great Fire had consumed the old London, but in its place, it had given birth to something greater, a London of stone and vision, of order and resilience, a city not simply rebuilt, but remade. The Great Fire of London was more than a disaster of 4 days in September 1666. Its smoke and heat faded, its ruins cooled, but its legacy lingered far beyond the ashes. In the centuries that followed, the fire lived on as a presence in England's memory and imagination, shaping not only the appearance of London, but the identity of the nation. The city that emerged from the flames became something new, not merely a rebuilt capital, but a symbol of endurance, innovation, and the eternal capacity of people to find meaning in catastrophe. In the years immediately after the fire, London was transformed by law and necessity. The fire revealed the fragility of medieval building practices, and Parliament acted to ensure that such destruction would not easily be repeated. Statutes demanded that houses be made of brick and stone, that streets be widened, that open spaces be preserved as buffers against flame. These regulations formed the skeleton of the modern city. The crowded, combustible maze of timber lanes that had perished in the fire gave way to a London that was more ordered, more permanent, more secure. The fire, in this sense, became a brutal teacher, and the rebuilt city its lesson written in brick. The new St. Paul's Cathedral rose slowly but steadily over the decades, its dome ascending as if to declare that the city had triumphed over ruin. For Londoners of the late 17th and 18th centuries, the dome was more than architecture. It was reassurance. It stood above the skyline like a guardian, visible from ships approaching the Thames, a promise that the city was not only alive, but renewed. Over time, St. Paul's became the place where national events were marked, where victories at sea were celebrated, where heroes of war were honored, where the people gathered in times of mourning and thanksgiving alike. The dome that Wren designed, born from the fire, came to embody England's endurance and faith. The fire also shaped the identity of London as a city of resilience. To be a Londoner in the centuries that followed was to carry the memory of calamity and recovery. The fire was recounted in sermons, in plays, in pamphlets that described it as both judgment and mercy. Children learned of it as part of their city's story, a tale that explained not only why certain parishes had vanished, but why the city itself looked as it did. The Great Fire joined the Plague, the Civil Wars, and the Armada as one of the great crises through which the nation had passed, a reminder that England endured not because it was spared suffering, but because it overcame it. In the broader arc of history, the fire helped propel England toward modernity. The lessons of urban planning, of construction, and of civic preparedness reverberated far beyond London. Other cities looked to its example. recognizing that narrow streets and wooden structures were invitations to disaster. In time, fire insurance companies emerged, offering both protection for citizens and, indirectly, the seeds of organized firefighting. The fire thus played an unexpected role in the creation of institutions that would guard not only London, but cities everywhere against future peril. The cultural memory of the fire proved equally enduring. Writers and poets returned to it again and again, seeing in its flames metaphors for judgment, for purification, for renewal. Painters captured the dramatic scenes of the inferno, the red sky glowing above the river, the silhouette of churches and halls in flame. The event became a touchstone for reflections on human fragility and divine providence, on the vanity of wealth and the resilience of community. It was not simply a disaster to be mourned, but a parable to be retold. Even in popular imagination, the fire retained its power. Folktales of omens and conspiracies persisted long after the Commission of Inquiry had laid the blame on the city's own fabric. The name of Thomas Fariner remained tied to the first spark, though he lived on to see the city rebuilt. Foreigners, once scapegoated, remained in memory as part of the story. The fire, in the collective consciousness, became both history and legend, a blend of fact and tale that gave it a life beyond chronology. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the fire lay in its paradoxical gift of opportunity. Out of devastation came a chance to renew, to imagine, to build better. The medieval city, with its winding alleys and timbered houses, might have lingered for centuries, vulnerable to every spark. The fire swept it away in days, opening the space for a new vision. The city that emerged, of brick and stone, of widened streets and ordered squares, was the foundation upon which modern London rose. Without the fire, that transformation might never have come. As the centuries passed, London endured further trials, plagues, wars, bombardments, but the fire of 1666 remained a touchstone, a reminder of both fragility and strength. When the city was bombed during the Blitz of the Second World War, images of St. Paul's standing defiantly amid smoke evoked not only wartime courage, but also the memory of Wren's dome rising from the ashes of the fire. The connection was immediate. Just as London had risen from ruin once, so it would again. The fire of 1666 thus spoke across time, linking generations in a shared narrative of survival. The fire's place in the collective memory of England ensured that it became part of the nation's identity. It was taught in schools, commemorated in ceremonies, woven into the larger story of a people who had endured adversity and emerged stronger. The tale of a city burning and being rebuilt became a metaphor for England itself, tested by flame, yet never consumed. To recall the fire was to recall not only loss, but the capacity to rise again. In this way, the Great Fire of London lived on, not as an end, but as a beginning. It destroyed, but it also cleared. It humbled, but it also inspired. It scarred, but it also strengthened. The city that emerged was both different and the same, different in stone and plan, the same in spirit and resolve. The fire had threatened to erase London, but instead it inscribed upon the city a deeper meaning, one that echoed across centuries. The legacy of the fire reminds us that catastrophe and renewal are often intertwined. Out of ruin may come resolve, out of loss may come vision. The Great Fire was not merely a chapter of destruction, it was a turning point, a moment when London ceased to be a medieval city and began to become the modern capital it is today. Its ashes were the soil from which new strength grew. As one looks upon London now, with its crowded streets and towering skyline, it is easy to forget that all of it was once reduced to embers. Yet the memory endures, in the dome of St. Paul's, in the lines of brick houses, in the stories that are still told. To walk the city is to walk upon layers of memory, each street a reminder that fire once swept here, and that life returned stronger than before. The Great Fire of London, then, is not merely history, it is legacy. It is the story of a city undone and remade, of a people tested and enduring, of a nation finding in flame not only destruction, but the spark of rebirth. And as long as London stands, so too will the memory of those 4 days in September 1666, when fire consumed a city and gave birth to a new one.